Order. Welcome to the Public Accounts Committee on Thursday the 19th of December 2024, and a warm welcome to all our witnesses too, and thank you for coming and so close to Christmas. The Public Accounts Committee has been scrutinising the delivery of High-Speed 2 since 2013 in the early days of the programme. Last year, significant changes were announced to the HS2 programme, including the cancellation of Phase 2 to Manchester and plans for a smaller station at London Euston. HS2 remains a large and complex programme with significant risks for value to money. Questions remain about how the programme will be reset and put back on the track following the changes. And so today we will question the Department for Transport and HS2 Limited about how they will deliver value for money from HS2, how they're progressing with changes at Euston Station and their work to manage the cancellation of Phase 2. So we're very warm welcome to our witnesses today. We have in front of me Dame Bernadette Kelly, who of course is the DCB, who is the Permanent Secretary of the Department for Transport, and probably knows more about this subject than she would care to admit. But anyway, you're very welcome, Dame Bernadette. On her left and her right, my left, is Mark Wilde. Warm welcome to you, Mark Wilde, because Mark Wilde is the new Chief Executive Officer of HS2 Limited, I think appointed on the 2nd of December.
That's right, Chair.
So this is going to be a bit of a baptism by fire. So you're welcome. We've, of course, met in your other capacity with the Queen Elizabeth line. And on further on to my left is Alan Foster, who's the Chief Financial Officer and Interim CEO. And a particular warm welcome to Alan Foster, as it's his first time on the committee.
It is.
So well done. And on the left is Alan Over, who's the Director General of Major Rail Projects Group and Senior Responsible Owner for High-Speed 2 programme. So thank you very much, all of you. And we are particularly pleased this morning to welcome our guest member for the session, Ruth Cadbury, who is Chair of the Transport Select Committee. And she's guesting on this committee. Right, where was that question? So, can I perhaps start with you, Dame Bernadette, and Mark Wilde? Since 2013, this committee has repeatedly raised questions about the cost of HS2. And in response, HS2 Limited and DfT told the committee that costs were under control when they were clearly not. Why should we be more assured by your promises this time around?
So shall I start by just updating the committee on the current position on costs on the programme, which we have set out as well in the parliamentary report published on Tuesday. We do not currently have an agreed cost estimate now for the for Phase 1 of HS2 Limited. And this is clearly an unacceptable position, so I want to acknowledge that. Immediately. The key reason, I think, when I last appeared before you, was about a year ago, shortly after the government's decisions on Network North. At that point, we had published two outturn estimates. One was the department's estimate of 45 to 54 billion. The other was the estimate which HS2 Limited had provided of 49 to 57 billion from memory. Since then, we have been working to establish with HS2 what an accurate and robust cost range for this project now is. I'm afraid I have to report we do not have such an estimate. Earlier this year, HS2 Limited provided a further upwardly revised estimate, which again we have reported for full transparency in the parliamentary report, of 54 to 66 billion for Phase 1. That is an unassured figure. We do not regard it as a reliable and agreed cost estimate. I say with great regret, sitting before the committee, that is the current situation. We will, I'm sure, discuss at some length the reasons for this uncertainty and the drivers of these cost increases, and I'm happy to talk about them. I'm also keen to set out the steps that we are now taking, and HS2 Limited is now taking, to bring this project under control. I accept the clear criticism in your question. We have to break, I think, this cycle of cost escalation on this programme once and for all, and we will set out the steps that we are intending to take to do that, Chair. I don't know where you want me to go now, but I'm happy to say more on any of those points. But I know you will have many questions.
I think it will become clear from questions from my colleagues where we're going to go. But I think just before I ask my colleagues to come in, when will this situation be resolved?
So this work is going to take some time now to arrive at a revised estimate, and not just a cost estimate. This is a whole programme reset that we are currently embarked upon and working hard towards. We are asking Mark Wilde, obviously now as the incoming CEO, to lead this work within the company, which we will then need to agree in government and in the department. It is extremely complex. It has many facets. We need to reach agreement on a cost estimation methodology, which we don't currently have. We will need to agree as part of that how outstanding risks on the programme will be dealt with. We need to agree a revised range on cost and schedule. We need to agree the future funding profile for this programme in the next phase of the spending review, because we will need to determine both what is most efficient and what is affordable within fiscal constraints. We will need to agree a plan to drive down cost and drive up productivity in every element of delivery, including renegotiating the main works contracts. We will need to ensure, Mark will need to ensure, that the company has the right capability and culture to deliver, and we are going to have to ensure that governance is effective. I say that to ensure that the committee understands why it is going to take time. It is not going to be quick to resolve this situation. We anticipate this work taking well into 2025.
Well, thank you for the candour of your answer. A, for admitting that it's not acceptable, which is not, that we don't have a full cost, at least in an envelope, and B, the work that you need to do. I suppose the question that immediately follows from what you've just said is, this is a large amount of work. Is it likely to be completed? Well, presumably it will have to be completed in time for the spending review in the spring.
So it won't be fully completed in time for the spending review in spring, because we think there is simply too much work to do. I will ask Mark Wilde to speak to this a little more in a moment, if you don't mind, because he has, of course, experience of exactly this sort of reset from Crossrail, and I know this is already something which is very much on his mind as he thinks about how to do this work. We will need a clear enough sense of the challenges on the programme and the costs of the programme to agree in the spending review what the funding profile for it is going to be for the 3 years beyond 25-26. Clearly, we will have to reach agreement with the Treasury on that, and we'll have to reach agreement as part of that on how we're going to deal with contingency, for example, on uncertainty. So the spending review will be a really important input, but I do not think our current expectation is not that the work will be fully complete at that point.
So I'm going to bring Mark Wilde in a minute, but could we just know, and there'll be lots of questions, I think, in a minute about the disparity of these figures. Yeah. Are you, the department, and Mark Wilde, HS2 Limited, completely agreed on what the figures that have been spent so far and what the work has been completed so far? So at least we're starting from a common base of fact.
Yes, I believe we are completely agreed on the spend to date, which is set out in the parliamentary report, 32.8 billion. And I think we are agreed on what work has been carried out. The areas of uncertainty are around the cost estimation for the work still to be done, the treatment of risk, for example, in the work still to be done, and the extent to which a really rigorous plan for driving productivity and efficiency will enable the company and us to bring the costs of this programme under control. So there are areas where we are fully aligned, but there is a lot of work to do to get us fully aligned now on the future of the programme.
And ministers need to take decisions on those 2 small areas of scope to provide the complete picture for Mark to do his analysis on, which we're working through with them at the moment, which are the former stubs linking to the former northern sections of the route.
Okay, well, we'll come to all of that in a minute too. Mark, I suppose it's only fair, before I bring in my colleagues in, to bring you in. It's a bit like déjà vu for you, isn't it? You were in exactly this position with the Queen Elizabeth line, but you've now got it on a slightly larger scale. Do you want to make a comment on all this?
Yes, well, good morning to the committee. Could I just set out how I think we stand as a programme and also how I aim to go forward with the work with the department, of course, and my colleague, Mr. Foster. Can I just say it's an honour to run this programme. It's a lot of people have said, it's a challenge, but certainly this is a vital project. We're focused on phase 1, but of course, even phase 1 in its singularity is of great importance to the country. It's a strategic asset. I was happy to host the Transport Committee Chair and colleagues at Old Oak Common yesterday, and I'm sure you would agree it's an impressive facility. Also, I think although I've only been here 3 weeks, I have had quite a long period waiting to come in. I've managed to informally work with colleagues over the summer. Can I just acknowledge how hard people are working on this project and the quality of the work? 31,000 people working extraordinary achievements. Let's just record our thanks to people for all of their hard works. But it's clear, though, that it is a completely unacceptable position where we're in. It is a little bit like Crossrail, but it's occurred much more at the beginning of the project, which in itself is a concern, but maybe is an opportunity as well. It's clear to me we have to acknowledge that HS2, in its singular mission, core mission to control costs, deliver this for the lowest feasible cost, has failed. I think, I need to start from the position that I really do respect and honour all of the work done by HS2 people in our supply chain, but we have to acknowledge HS2 has failed in its mission to control costs. As Dame Bernadette said, we must break the cycle, which has been completely unacceptable. I've thought deeply about this. The positive news is I think that we are aligned with the department on the core reasons for what this is. I would like just in a moment to set out what I think the enduring systemic problems are. There have been 1 or 2 serious exogenous events that I don't think any programme could have predicted, the war in Ukraine and the effects of COVID, but there are 3 things that are systemic, they are enduring, they go back to the origins of this project's notice to proceed, and they are, in my view, and I'm sure we are aligned on this side of the table on these things. Firstly, construction started way too early on this project. The rush to start before mature design consents was really, in retrospect, a mistake. So number 1, I think construction started far too early on the project in certain areas. Secondly, the contracts intrinsically moved the risk to HS2 Limited to manage. It was a conscious and intrinsic decision, reviewed quite expertly by the NAO at the time, and the NAO at the time commented that HS2 Limited must be prepared to manage this change of risk profile. I believe HS2 Limited has not managed the risk profile in an optimal way. I don't mean to criticise people, it must have been very, very challenging, but the facts are the transition of risk from the supply chain to HS2 has resulted in a situation where our contracts are effectively cost reimbursable and HS2 must therefore manage the risk profile. I don't think that's been done in a coherent way, and we get an opportunity to fix that. Thirdly, and very seriously, the programme now, since the baseline of 2019, is no longer viable. The activities, as you all know, every project, whether it's a small one or a mega programme, needs a baseline, a performance baseline. The last baseline here was 2019. If you now look in 2024 at where we are, the activities are all out of synchronism, mostly because of lack of productivity. There are some effects, which I'm sure the department colleagues will cover, about Network North and decisions on Euston. But the fundamental issue is the productivity assumptions at the beginning have not come to pass. So we started too early. HS2 hasn't managed the risk profile in an optimal way. And we're in a position now where the baseline bears the actual activities bear no relation to the baseline. These are very, very serious systemic issues. It's not my position to critique what had happened. My job with Mr. Foster is to take it forward. Dame Bernadette said we need a reset, need to break the cycle. We must form a new baseline programme. It'll take all of 2025 to actually set the activities into the right position, and then it may take a little bit time after that to get what would be called an assured contractualised baseline. So I think the reality is it won't be till mid-26 that we will be sitting here with an assured baseline that could be properly measured against. That may seem an extraordinary amount of time, but as the Chair will remember, in Crossrail, I actually got this wrong at the beginning of Crossrail. We tried to set the baseline within 6 months, and it was proven to be too optimistic. So I think I would request that we're given the time and space to do this. Obviously, though, in that interim period, we need to act in productivity today. We can't simply go and do our homework for 18 months. And the second thing we need to do is to recontractualise and bear down on costs at the moment. I'm sure there'll be questions from Mr. Foster. I'm very pleased, actually, the work of Mr. Foster over the summer. It's entirely coherent with what I'm suggesting. We've actually worked closely together, and I am to take on board. So I'm sure Mr. Foster will be pleased to answer any questions about what we're doing already.
Right.
Because it is
Stop
true.
you there, Mr. Wilde. That's very helpful. It's given us an awful lot to digest from the two of you. So let's just try and, for the minute, just concentrate around costs as far as we're able to. And to help us with that, I'm going to ask Sarah Green to come in, please.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Dame Bernadette, for outlining what was in the update, which goes into some detail, but also makes it very clear that you disagree over how much this is going to cost. And my first question is, why do you disagree? You're looking at the same data, you're looking at the same information. Why don't you agree on what this is going to cost? What's the difference?
So we have disagreed. It is true, and as I say, we've been explicit about that in the past. What we now, however, all do agree upon is that we need an agreed cost estimation methodology. The points that we've been challenging on from the department when we've seen those estimates from the company, and Mr. Over may wish to say more, but we've been challenging on whether the cost estimation methodology underpinning those numbers is robust, whether the supply chain data and management information is sufficiently robust, whether the assumptions about future risk, etc., are correct, and there's a host of quite technical issues on which we have been challenging the company when we have seen those estimates. I think both we and the company acknowledge that we must now align around a single set of figures, and I think I hope Mr. Foster will acknowledge that we all agree that we do not have a reliable estimate at the moment. So one of the things we are currently doing is getting some technical third-party advice on cost estimation, which will then allow us to reach agreement on that fundamental sort of underpinning for cost. There are then a whole host of other things we will also need to agree upon, as I say, including what the productivity and sort of efficiency plan needs to do to deliver at lowest feasible cost. So we have disagreed. There are quite technical things underpinning that disagreement. We have a pathway through now, I think, and a plan to resolve that.
I'd like to ask Alan the same question, if I may.
Yeah. So, do you mind, Chair, if I just introduce myself briefly?
Of course, please do. Yes, please.
So, first of all, to say, as it's stated, I am the Chief Financial Officer of HS2 substantively, but I joined in July 2022, been with the programme now for nearly 2.5 years, and my role has expanded in that period, and more recently I have been interim CEO to bridge the gap between Sir John and Mark joining. And I do want to just say how incredibly disappointed and frustrated that I am that since I have joined that I've been in this cycle of reporting repeated updates in the cost. But and I realise it's unacceptable, but also that of course it's important that we are transparent and clear about what we see our financial position. I'll pause on the intro there to really come to our position in sharing cost has been to use the best available information that we have to us as a company. And so in compiling the forecast that we've done, we've used that information. There are limitations though in that information. We are very much dependent upon our supply chain to provide us the information that we can then use to form and assess those things. So we are aware it is not the basis of estimate that we would like to be producing with the full reliability that this committee and the department would demand. And so our basis of engagement with the department has been that they observe the limitations that we have in the data and are choosing judgments in some areas which mean that we have a difference in cost range. But our cost range is based on the best information we have available to us, the most recent update. So ordinarily, and when we presented the formal estimates in the autumn of last year, that had been through a very thorough process of analysis, challenge assumptions, review and assurance. And so that has an added layer of confidence. But through the first half of this year, we've been engaging more deeply with our supply chain. We've been getting new information and data. And as we were seeing the significant cost increases that was coming through in those projections, we felt it necessary to provide, in the order of transparency, a view that the costs we were seeing these pressures again, and hence have, on an accelerated basis, shared that data. We accept that it is not as mature and as challenged and reliable as we would want to be, which is why we too agree that this needs to be an input into the reset. And as Mark was describing, we now need to use that as a plan to get to a reliable position.
But, Mr. Foster, sorry to interrupt, Ms. Green. I mean, cost escalations are one thing. We all know about all the extenuating circumstances, the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, inflation and so on. But to not even have a basic understanding of the methodology of how you're going to arrive at these costs seems to me absolutely incredible, isn't it?
Well, the size, the scale and complexity of this program is extraordinary, and therefore, and the amount of time and risk and activities that are still in front of us. And there are many different experts with many different methods in terms of calculating and performing these bases. So we do have a methodology, and we have got an estimate for doing those.
Between you and the department, is it?
But it does need to now be agreed more transparently with the department.
And in that transparent process, and I'm sorry, Ms. Green, I can't bring you in and say, will that transparency, will it be in the public domain what the methodology is precisely?
We are working through the process of developing that, and we are going through a process of working at HS2, the department, and also we've established an oversight group with the HMT representative on the HS2 board as well participating. So in order to make sure that we are bringing forward agreed assumptions and bases for estimates going forward, we are doing that through that process.
That's a brilliant answer, but it didn't answer my question, which was, will it be fully in the public domain as to what it is?
That decision we haven't discussed.
We haven't. I mean, obviously, I would expect, given the intense interest in this, that we will want to provide as much information as possible, and we would expect to do that through the parliamentary report, etc. As we reset the programme, I think we will want to provide detail of the basis of that reset, what assumptions we've made, all sorts of things. So we will certainly be providing further public information. What that looks like is obviously something we'll need to consider.
Just as a supplementary to that question, there's been a pause in the 6 monthly reporting to Parliament, which this committee pushed and in fact I think succeeded in getting in the last Parliament. Is that going to be resumed?
I very much hope so. That is our expectation. The pause, I think, was largely driven by obviously an election falling, new ministers, new government. I think that interrupted the drumbeat of reports. It is my absolute intention that we now revert to 6 monthly reports. I think they are very important for ensuring good parliamentary reporting on this project. So I would expect another parliamentary report to be provided after the spending review, actually,
That's
within
really
natural time.
Really helpful, Dame Bernadette. Ms. Green, I'm so sorry to interrupt you.
It's all right, but just to follow up, when will that methodology be agreed? So
We're in the process of doing it. This is a highly technical process, and indeed I might ask Mr. Over to talk about it. It's deeply, deeply technical, and we are we're getting expert technical advice to support that. But as I say, it's one element of a number of things that we are trying to resolve. So, for example, and this goes to, I think, Mr. Foster's point, back in 2023, we commissioned, when we saw a lot of volatility in the numbers, I commissioned an internal audit, and that concluded at that point that there were weaknesses in the supply chain data that HS2 was receiving. That in turn meant that some of the figures that we were seeing were not reliable and could not be relied upon. So these are the issues that we're trying to resolve. I don't know, Mr. Over, if you want to say more about the specifics of cost estimation methodology.
Thanks. I mean, the first thing I want to say is that we're putting these differences behind us. It's no good to the public or to Parliament or to our ministers to have different sets of figures in play. It was regrettable that we had to take that different position. It was based on different judgments about how much risk remained, the treatment of costs that had been taken out of scope, and how much productivity could be driven through management action. Some of those are judgments, and it's okay to have different judgments, but ultimately the job for Alan and Mark and me is to provide ministers with advice on a range that can be delivered within, and we want to get this right, and we want to get it right once so that it will see the way to the rest of the project being delivered in a way that Mark and the company and the 30,000 people working on it can live within. So what we're doing now is we've set up a joint piece of work that, as Alan said, is sponsored by me and the Treasury and the company to make sure that we're embarking on this in a coherent way with full agreement. We've got the technical advice on what needs to be changed in the methodologies. Mark will want to have a view on that and make sure he's comfortable with it and is part of that work already. So I'm confident in the coming 2 to 3 months we'll have unanimity on the methodology and be well through the work to progress it. But Mark's right, it's a lot of work. It needs to be done in detail, and then there does have to be some constructive tension. Mark and Alan and Bernadette and me will agree that we don't have to agree on everything, and part of the purpose of getting to a good, robust answer is to have that constructive challenge, and the point is it has to be constructive and it has to lead to common advice at the end of it.
Forgive me, you've already had 12 months. This phase 2 was cancelled 12 months ago, and you've come to us 12 months later not agreeing on a methodology and not agreeing on what it's going to cost. So what confidence do you think that gives us as a committee that the department is willing to publicly disagree in this way? Like, what confidence can we have, or could you comment on how much confidence you think we should have that you are going to come back in a few months' time agreeing?
Well, you'll have to judge your level of confidence. I can quite understand why, based on where we are now, the confidence level is low. That's a very reasonable position to take. I think what I hope we can try and set out today is the steps that we are now taking, and I hope what you will hear from myself and Alan, but also from Mark Wilde and Alan Foster, is that we have absolute common purpose now in resolving this situation and being able to bring to the committee an agreed and reliable plan for how the rest of this programme is going to now be delivered effectively.
If I could I comment?
Of course,
that,
Mr. Wilde.
I think that I've looked at this in some detail about the passage of time, and the problem is rooted in the Memwork Civils contracts. These are some of the biggest contracts that have ever been let. As I said, I think HS2 Limited, at the very beginning of the notice to proceed, did not activate these contracts correctly. I would say in the year that's passed, a great deal of progress has been made, and there is much more convergence. It doesn't quite answer your question. There's more to do. I do want to get across the point, though, that we need a fundamental reset of this programme. And whilst the methodology of how we account for the numbers is important, and I think great work has been done, it'll continue to be done, the real work that needs to be done is to re-baseline this schedule and put everybody back into position. This is very important because at the moment the problem is contained within the Memwork Civils. The stations contracts are now starting to come to maturity, and we are just letting these systems contracts. So this will continue to repeat until we reset the programme and improve the methodology. So it doesn't surprise me at all that it's taken us a year, and I have seen better convergence, but there is a need for a fundamental reset.
Very helpful, thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Sarah Olney.
Thank you, Chair. Once you've agreed amongst yourselves what the new costs look like, you're then going to have to go back to the Treasury, Dame Bernadette. What do you think? What is your estimate of the timescale for getting a new agreement from the Treasury?
Firstly, I would say Treasury are very closely involved in this work. So it's not as if we do lots of work and then it's not a sequential thing. We're constantly engaging with the Treasury on this work. They're very much part of the joint endeavour to reset this programme. Obviously, there's a huge amount of money and they have a very strong interest in ensuring that we reach a better position on this. And of course, the Treasury has recently appointed a new non-executive representative on the committee, David Goldstone, who is also now very much part as the board of HS2 in supporting this work. So it's kind of not like we do a lot of work and then go to the Treasury. The Treasury are sort of in the tent as we do all of this work, and I think that's really important. We have a ministerial task force, of course, which the Secretary of State chairs, but which the Chief Secretary to the Treasury is a part of. I think a really important, though, step in resetting the programme, but it will be a step and it will not be the conclusion, will be the spending review. Phase 2, at that point we will need to agree with the Treasury what is the right funding profile for the programme for the effectively for the remainder of this Parliament, and that in turn will be an important sort of plank in determining what the outturn range and what the eventual cost of the programme will be. So we are constantly in dialogue with the Treasury and working very, very closely with them. So I just wanted to sort of slightly correct, as it were, the sort of sense that we go to them at the end.
I am really, really sorry, and I'm really sorry to the whole of our witnesses and everything else, but Luke Charteris has a time deadline. Can we just switch, just for a second? We'll come back to finances for sure, but can we switch for a second to Luke Charteris and the vexed subject of a back tunnel?
Thank you, and good morning. My question's addressed to you, Mr. Weil, and of course we've had the infamous £100 million back shed receiving a lot of media attention. Natural England did not require HS2 to build the tunnel, and it left it to you to decide. Spending £100 million on a back cave is a shocking waste of taxpayer money. So will you apologise, or do you at least have some regrets about this?
I might invite Mr. Foster to talk in detail about the actual engineering and the consenting process, which I think is worth.
Can we keep this sort of fairly tight, because we've got so much to cover?
But what I would say is I understand why that would raise public concern. It seems an extraordinary amount of money. But I would say this. I've actually visited this structure myself in my first week to see it. It's of great concern to me to understand. This is a considerable engineering structure. It's in a railway that will travel at over 200 miles an hour. So the engineering of this whole system is quite considerable. Also, at the end of the day, HS2 must obviously comply with the law. And the law says that we must mitigate damage, harm to protected species. It's our job to mitigate it. You're quite right. Natural England don't tell us what to do. It's our job to mitigate it. I think there was up to 15 different options to do this. One of them was even tunnelling underneath it. We simply have to comply with the law. The mitigation that's been arrived at by our contractors and experts in this field is the most appropriate in terms of the context of the railway.
If I'm correct, Mr. Wilde, if I may, you have no regrets about the £100 million plus expenditure?
I understand and I can sympathise with from the outside why this seems an extraordinary amount of money. I've looked at this extensively. I've visited the site myself. At the end of the day, HS2 Limited must comply with the law. The law says we must mitigate. We simply must do that in the law. Then we need to gain planning permission to get it. I think for legislative purposes, for parliamentarians, there's probably a lot to unpack about this. HS2 needs to get 8,500 consents. This is a complex one, so I can't apologise for complying with the law. This structure is the most appropriate. It is an extraordinary amount of money, but it's in the context of a scheme that is costing tens of billions, and it's built for 120 years. It also needs to gain planning permission with Buckinghamshire Council, which was very protracted. There was at least a 4-year delay that eventually was resolved by the planning inspector. So it's a complex issue, it's a sensitive area, I am sorry from the outside about how much this may seem to cost, but at the end of the day, it's the most appropriate mitigation to comply with the law.
Right, I think we're going to leave this here.
Can I just ask
so,
one quick
well,
follow-up, please,
we've got an
if
awful
that's
lot
okay.
to cover, please, Mr. Oxford.
It's a very quick one.
Okay.
Which is to say, because I've been looking at Hull's COPS as well, and there's a significant amount of expenditure around Great Crested Newts. Do you know how much you're spending on these mitigation schemes, and will you publish the amount of money that you're spending on the protection? It's an important species, but for taxpayer transparency, will you publish how much you're spending on these schemes?
I don't immediately know the answer to that question in terms of doing it, and I cannot commit that we will have the detail to know precisely on the Great Crested Newts, but I can take that question away and look at how we can answer that.
Thank you
May
very
I make just one?
Yes, but before you do reply, I was going to just follow this.
Okay.
I mean, clearly there is a balance here between the law on protecting species and the amount of money spent.
Read.
And I think most people would say in this instance that balance was not acceptable. So as Permanent Secretary, I think this is an issue you're going to need to think about, or the government's going to need to think about, the balance between the amount of... I mean, after all, how many doctors and nurses would have 100 million bought you, actually treating people who are in dire need? So I think there is a balance that needs to be had here, and I think there may be an issue in terms of the law that you need to look at.
So I strongly agree, and this was the point I was going to come in on. As I think Mark Wilde's made very clear, the reason HS2 is building this structure is because they must comply with the law. In this instance, the law is the Wildlife and Countryside Act and the Habitats and Species Regulations. They must mitigate the damage, harm to these bats, and that's why they have had to build this structure. The cost of the structure is something that we did look extremely closely at, as did HS2 Limited, as Mr. Wilder said. Numerous options were looked at. When it became clear that the costs were as significant as they are, we in the department, the Treasury, robustly challenged this structure and this solution. We got Arup to look at the engineering construction to see whether it could be delivered more efficiently. We led work, actually with DEFRA and Natural England, to test whether legal compliance was really where this structure suggested it was. The unfortunate conclusion of all of that challenge was that this structure was the most efficient remedy available to HS2 Limited. But that does, I think, and the Prime Minister himself has pointed this out, raise a wider question about how we balance environmental obligations and cost in delivering the infrastructure the nation needs. And whether that balance is in the right place is ultimately a policy judgment for ministers. But I strongly agree with the sentiment.
That's very helpful, don't you? If you don't mind, Luke Charteris, I'm going to leave it there because we've got so much to cover. But thank you for coming today. Sarah Olney.
Thank you, Chair. Dame Bernadette, you had just responded to me to say that once there's an agreement between HS2 and the Department for Transport as to what the new costs look like, you're working very closely with the Treasury. Your answer seemed to imply that you think once you have landed on this figure, which we know is going to be somewhere between 45 and 66 billion, that it will just be a formality that the Treasury will sign up.
No, it absolutely won't be. I mean, that's why Treasury are involved in this in every step of the way. They too will want to challenge, just as we challenge HS2 Limited on cost estimates they provide to us, so Treasury also provide that challenge. I don't expect this to be a formality at all. I expect this to be a very close process of engagement, dialogue and debate.
Just to be clear, what I'm saying is because you're saying that Treasury involved every step of the way, once you've reached agreement, you expect it to be quite soon after that Treasury will sign off on the budget?
Well, I just think these processes are going to run in parallel in practice. As I say, we are now proceeding with the second phase of the spending review to conclude in the spring. As part of that, we will need to agree with the Treasury what the funding profile for HS2 Limited, for HS2 Phase 1 is going to be. This is a very large chunk of our total departmental capital. So we will have to resolve that. We'll have to decide both, as I say, what is affordable within a tight fiscal envelope, both for the department and the government, but also what is efficient. And the case we will make, and actually the Treasury have been receptive to this case in setting the budget for next year, is that it is ultimately wasteful of money and poor value for money, to sort of slow down work artificially in order to sort of reduce spend in the short term.
I was coming to that because in the report it makes clear that the need to keep annual spending under a certain limit has actually increased overall cost. Are you going to be, is your case to the Treasury going to be that you need that overall spend limit rather than these annual?
So yes, totally. We do need a long-term spending profile for this programme. Annual spending, annual financial agreements are really poor for long-term infrastructure delivery. We all know that. The Treasury knows
not
that.
Just HS2,
and not just HS2, everything.
And
that's unfortunately been the situation we've largely been in recent years. But Treasury would absolutely acknowledge that's a highly unsatisfactory way to deliver a programme of this sort. And as I say, they are very, very conscious. Clearly, there have been decisions taken in the past by the previous government to defer aspects of HS2 Limited on the basis of financial constraints, and sometimes those difficult decisions have to be taken. But it is well understood by us, by the company and by Treasury, that sometimes slowing spend down can significantly increase total cost at the end and reduce value for money. So that's the debate we'll be having.
Thank you. Something else which I think the committee find unsatisfactory is the fact that this 45 to 66 billion spread is still being expressed in 2019 prices.
Yes, it is unsatisfactory, and we expect again to agree with the Treasury as part of the spending review an adjustment so that we are dealing in current prices. That's a conversation we're having with the Treasury. They are very receptive to this. Obviously, the longer we use 2019 prices, the more detached from reality we're becoming, and also the more inefficient it is for the company to try and work in two price bases. So I would expect us to adjust that in the spending review.
When do you think when the spending review happens is when you will finally start to use these numbers? Use 2025 numbers as there will be.
This is my expectation. We'll need to decide whether it's 24 or 25 cost base at that point. But that is my expectation. I think we've had positive conversations with the Treasury. They understand this needs to be done.
So given the 45 to 66 billion spread is in 2019 prices, we can expect to see that shift upwards, can we?
Yes, obviously, because that period of time has included a period of very high inflation and very high construction inflation. It's important, though, to understand, because I know the headlines that this will inevitably attract when that shift is made. This is a technical adjustment. It's not a cost overrun.
It is still an increase.
It's different. It's an increase in cash terms, but it is a technical adjustment. It is different in nature, I think, from a
completely
cost,
understand the point that you're making,
overrun.
but it is an increase.
I understand. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Ms. Olney. You've been very candid this morning, Dame Bernadette, but there will be people listening to this session, and they will be immensely frustrating. And I can't put it better than the renowned professor of the London School of Economics, Tony Travers, and I'm going to quote what he said in the FT yesterday, and I'm going to quote it in full to get your reaction, please. And he said, "It's extraordinary, and not in a good way, that the project could knock down people's homes, undermine local businesses, take over the surrounding environment in the process, and almost a decade later still not have a clear plan or budget for such a crucially located site in one of the world's wealthiest cities." This was in relation to Euston. I mean, it is a pretty poor state, isn't it? I mean, the project has been going for 12 years. We have had the extraordinary events that I did allude to earlier, but it does not reflect well on this country of how to manage a major government project, does it?
So I have a great deal of sympathy with that critique. This is not where we would want this programme to be. When we talk about, though, the drivers, it's some of the challenges which we are still dealing with now are ones which date from this project's inception. You know, we're going back 15 years now when we look at HS2, and it's possible to see a whole host of things which have caused us to cause challenges for the programme. Point one about any project delivery would be you should have a plan and stick to it. That has not been the case for HS2. High speed and therefore high cost was embedded in this project from the very beginning, and I think we might now question whether those choices were the right choices. Building between densely populated city centres on old infrastructure is very expensive. The cost of planning and environmental obligations in the UK are very high, and I think our financial allocation processes, which we were just talking about, are not always well suited to effective delivery of infrastructure. So there's a massive critique, I think, that we can make around the challenges that HS2 has faced and the light they shed, as it were, on our ability in this country to deliver infrastructure efficiently and well. I think, though, that there's a sort of second set then of issues that we are looking at and that we've been particularly focusing our efforts on, because we can't change history and we can't change decisions that were made 10 years ago. We have to just deal now with the reality we have. And I think what we've been focusing on in our work over the last year or two is the problems that have arisen since notice to proceed in 2020. These are nearer term problems, and these are the ones now that we are addressing. As Mark Wilde has rightly said, many of those problems stem from the Mainworks Civils contracts. That is by far the largest driver of cost here.
Well, that was going to be my next question. I mean, I think basically this project was probably missold at the beginning. If it hadn't been sold as a high-speed project but a higher capacity project, the whole thing might have been redesigned and we might be in a different place.
I personally strongly agree with that.
But we are where we are.
We are where we are.
So let's deal with what we can do about it. So I'm going to pass quickly to you, Mark Wilde. I mean, as I said earlier, this really is deja vu for you, because many of the same problems here are the same problems that were there with the Queen Elizabeth line. So let's start with these contracts, because the contracts, it seems to me, is going to be the major part of getting control of the costs. So let's start where we are on civils. You had exactly the same problem on Queen Elizabeth line. How are you going to get control of the civils contract so we can get at least and then I'm going to come on with the integration after that in a minute.
I'll speak just for 1 minute, then I might invite Mr. Foster to speak about all the extensive work. So HS2 has learned a lot of lessons from Crossrail, and a key lesson learned was to have a fewer number of larger projects. Crossrail had 37 individual projects. Here we're going to end up with 10 or 12. I think the issue with the Mainworks Civils contracts is twofold. Firstly, they are of a size and scale that literally hasn't been done since the Victorian era. We haven't built an intercity line from London to the north of England for well over 100 years. So that they are of an extraordinary scale. Secondly, and very importantly, they started, I think, on completely the wrong foot. They started in an environment where the design, the consents, and the enabling works should have been completed to a higher degree. I think these projects got off on the wrong start. With the benefit of hindsight, it was a mistake. I think HS2 has to be accountable for that. In the contracts intrinsically is a risk transfer from the contractors to HS2 Limited. These are legally binding contracts, well reviewed by everybody at the time, and the absolute facts are that HS2 Limited started these contracts too early at too high a pace.
Can I just stop you all there? We've had the sort of, if you like, the bloodletting session. This session, we are now where we are. Can we not now go back over old ground? And I'm not in any criticism of any of you as witnesses, but I just want to sort of set the parameters of this hearing. So I specifically want to ask about these civils contracts. And you mentioned, and it's mentioned in the NA report, criticism of how they were drawn up, the incentives and so on and so forth. So prospectively going forward, what is your idea of how you're going to manage these very big projects from now? And I see you deferring to Mr. Foster. I'm very happy if he wants to answer that.
Yeah, I'll speak about the contract because we've been working over the last year on this, on improving the Mainworks Civils contracts to make them more fit for purpose. So if I just set out for you that there's 4 strands, as I put it, to the work that we're doing on these contracts. The first is that we've commenced a renegotiation of the terms of those contracts. With the support of government, we have a strategy around fix, control and reduce of these so that we can increase certainty around our costs, align the incentives better to drive more cost control and ensure that we are only paying for that is only necessary. As I talk about the renegotiation, though, we should be kind of clear.
How feasible is that renegotiation? Given you're locked into contracts at the moment, how feasible is it going to be to renegotiate these contracts?
We have to manage our expectations around these changes, but we are in partnerships, and there is a recognition that we need to find a better alignment of incentives between the taxpayer and the delivery of the works. And so we are looking at how we can make variations to those incentive mechanisms and find a way such that they can work better for both parties. This is clearly something where we have to reach a compromise, but there are opportunities there for improvement, and we do see that as an intrinsic part of the reset. And I've spoken to personally all of the CEOs of the parent companies. We've got 14 significant entities that sit above the JVs, and all have expressed the willingness to discuss and work through a renegotiation.
Very good to hear. Mark Wilde, when you came into Crossrail, you had obviously the construction contracts to deal with. You came in at the end of that process, you sorted that out. But actually what we found with that project was the most difficult bits was the systems integrations. And we don't want to get the line largely built and then start to find that all the bits are not talking to each other, which is what you had with Crossrail. This is an area of your specific expertise. Can you give this committee a flavour of the ideas of how we're not going to run into those problems again with this project?
So I think on the main work civils, the work of Mr. Foster and Alan in the department has been very substantial, but has to be in the context of a reset. I think, to answer your question, what are the prospects of renegotiation? That will only really occur in a reset. And that's important, Chair, in the question you've asked, that the very key thing to do that Crossrail got completely wrong was to make sure the civil engineering is completed cleanly before the systems contractors start. And the reason we need a reset, and it will break the cycle, as Dame Bernadette said, of this unacceptable continual drip feed of cost escalation, is we can drive the civil engineers to exactly what the systems people want. The systems contracts are in the process of being let right now. It's a very good procurement. The proponents are the right proponents. The technology is right technology. HS2 helpfully has not taken any novel technology on board. Key lesson from Crossrail: the technology that's been procured is standard technology used on continental railways. The key is to get the civil engineers' programs reset, properly incentivised, and get them off the field of play as soon as we possibly can. In parallel, spend the next 18 months to 2 years designing the systems to come in. This is why the reset is of fundamental importance. If we have no reset, the Crossrail effect will occur, that the system engineers end up in a muddle with the civil engineers. We will be in big trouble. We are not going to let that happen. That is why the reset will have to occur.
I'm sorry, I'm asking too many questions today, and my colleagues, please bear with me, but I do know a great deal about this subject, having been on the hybrid bill for well over a year. My question arising from all of everything we've heard this morning, until you get all this reset done, what is happening in the meanwhile?
Well, three things. Continuing the work of Mr. Foster, Mr. Rover, on bearing down on the main work civils. There is plenty to do in productivity. I think we're seeing a situation now, actually, with all the very positive work done in the past 6 months. We're at peak production, and the consenting and the design is getting more mature. There are many opportunities to bear down on cost, which we will do aggressively in the new year. Secondly, the intrinsic reset itself will produce efficiencies and the ability to strike deals, I'm sure. And thirdly, very importantly, the systems contracts and the stations need to continue with the design work. So there is plenty to do.
No, I get all of that. That's all part of the reset. But is actually work on the ground today continuing under the old system? And how do you know that that's providing value for money and it's going to be integrated into the whole new reset?
I think maybe just to conclude, as I say, when in terms of our bearing down on the main work civils contract, the renegotiation is just one strand. The other strands that I would highlight there is we are now getting the level of supply chain MI that we can really see productivity, which allows the opportunity to have more progress in driving. Importantly there, we're getting much better understanding of all of the exclusions and assumptions that were previously sort of not available to us. So, in short, we've got the chance to really now drive performance.
I'm grateful for those answers, but again, they're not quite answers to my questions. Today, as we sit here, is work still progressing on the ground, and how do you know that's going to be giving us value for money, and how do you know it's going to integrate into the whole of the
Can I try? So, ideally, we would be managing against the outturn cost on the long-range plan, because that's the best way to allow HS2 Limited and the supply chain to be efficient. Because we don't have that certainty at the moment, we're necessarily operating on an annual basis. That doesn't mean that money can't move in the margins between the years, but essentially we have an annual budget and an annual work plan, and that's how we're measuring performance. And we reset that year on year, and then we can measure how much of the scheduled milestones have been achieved and what the cost performance has been against the plan. And I think that's a necessary short-term intervention.
I get that, Mr. River. So the short answer to a short question is work is continuing on the ground on the previous basis. Yes. Correct. Thank you. Very pleased to have Ruth Cadbury, Chairman of the Transport Select Committee, with us.
Thank you, Sir Geoffrey, and thank you to HS2 for hosting the committee yesterday at Old Oak Common. We saw the work going on to build that very large station. So this meeting so far has very rightly focused on the cost issues of HS2 so far. I want to address the benefit side of the business case. And Mark Wilde has reminded us that this is a rail line for 120 years. The purpose is, I hope, still to address growth, regional imbalance, and the necessary expansion of capacity of passengers and freight that everybody accepts is so necessary on the West Coast rail network in England. So, are these wider and long-term benefits being fed into the benefit-cost ratio of the new business plan?
The short answer is yes. The benefits case is built on capacity, but also the sort of wider economic investment, growth, housing, jobs, etc., that the programme is able to support. We will need to do a revised business plan as part of this reset, and that will produce a revised business cost ratio. One of the things, though, and I think I've spoken before, certainly at this committee about this, and also at the Transport Select Committee under previous chair, one of the challenges for us sometimes is how we capture and evaluate the full benefits of a really big transformational project like this. My department's appraisal methodology is often criticised, and I think unfairly, for being too narrow. It's actually much more complex and sophisticated than is generally understood. But we do know that we don't always fully capture dynamic sort of land use changes, the benefits that come from those things. And we don't do that in part because it's uncertain. You can't predict those things with absolute certainty. One of the things we are doing at the moment is under our relatively new chief analyst, Ian Mulhern, is looking at our appraisal methodology, not just in relation to HS2, for everything we do on transport, to see whether there is more that we can do to capture what we call the level 3 benefits of programmes like HS2. And it's particularly important that we do that, because otherwise we're sort of missing out quite a critical element of what these sorts of investments are all about. If you look now at the Elizabeth line and the growth that is happening around stations on the Elizabeth line, for example, you see the enormous impact that this kind of investment can have. So, yes, is the short answer. We will, as part of this process of resetting the programme, also be re-evaluating and refreshing the business case.
And are you working with other stakeholders, and if so, which other stakeholders on these benefits? You talk about land value rises. Yeah. Well, that's possibly true. Do you mean just contained within the envelope of stations and so on, or do you mean the wider regional impacts?
So we'll be looking at a range of different things with stakeholders. I know that, and maybe that Alan Foster wants to say more about this, HS2 Limited, for example, have recently done some research to better understand the investment that is expected now to happen in the West Midlands as a consequence of the 2 new stations there and the depot. And that's produced some very positive, I think, indications of the housing and jobs and investment it's going to support. So yes, we will be working with local stakeholders. We already work at Old Oak Common with local stakeholders there on the housing and investment the station is expected to support. So we'll certainly want to work with colleagues both in London and in the West Midlands to evaluate the full benefits. I don't know whether, Alan, you want to say more about that particular
No, I think it's a very important side to us, and I think we've tried to bring attention really to that. We did a publication, Trains to Cranes, around the West Midlands, and that shows that around £10 billion of added economic activity is being realised in the West Midlands, also highlighting 41,000 new homes in the West Midlands vicinity around those stations. So I think it is a really important area, and we're planning to do something similar around Old Oak Common.
I think also with the West Midlands Combined Authority, looking at how that growth is achieved over a region, both with integrated transport delivery, but also the schemes around Curzon Street and Ardent Cross at Solihull. So if you put Euston and Ardent Cross and Old Oak Common together, we're looking at something like 40,000 new homes just from the schemes around the stations. Camden itself has just published research suggesting that the Euston station, when we get there, will deliver £40 billion of benefits to the UK economy. So it's very much got to be done in conjunction with our local partners, and that's just the direct benefits that we get around the stations. We've got to work with them to realise the regional benefits and do that together.
Thank you. And just, do we have a timescale, Dame Bernadette, for the for the revised business case?
It will be part of the reset. Obviously, until I have a reliable cost range, it's difficult to provide a business case update, but I would expect it to be part of the conclusion of this work we've been talking about.
Thank you. Thank you, Sir Geoffrey.
Right. I think, actually, before we get on to Euston, it would logically fit after that, Sarah Olney, would you just like to come in on third
Yes. Mr. Wilde, just coming back on the previous statements you were making about renegotiating with the main contractors. And reflecting on some of your introductory remarks as well about the necessity within HS2 and within the DfT for a reset on this programme. However, is it not the case that the third parties that you'll be talking to won't necessarily share your view that the whole thing needs to be reset? Are you not going to be a bit on the back foot in some of these renegotiations? And is that not going to create a bit of an obstacle as to how much can really be achieved?
These people are the same people that were in the Elizabeth line. They are really important people in the UK economy. They have, we have 31,000 jobs. They're very responsible shareholders. I think when we create the context, the reset of the programme, we will find the ability to have the appropriate commercial bargain and the transition of risk. I haven't found any, I don't know if Mr. Foster has, I haven't found any resistance. The simple fact is we have commercial contracts that are in a context where people are quite protective of their positions. The ability of a reset provides the opportunity for a fair allocation of risk, because we want our contractors to be safe, healthy, we want them to be profitable, we want them to be productive, that we want them to provide value for money. These contractors are some of the most important in the UK. They're the people who will build Sizewell, they're the people who build the electrification of the national grid, long-term people. We need to provide the context of a fair bargain between HS2, the supply chain, where we get value for money and we have productivity. And the problem we have at the moment is the contracts are unproductive. We are probably making suboptimal decisions because we haven't got a properly coordinated programme. Equally, to manage expectations, we are in an existing environment and I don't think we haven't got a blank sheet of paper. There is no prospect or intention to re-procure the whole of HS2. That wouldn't really serve us well. But I'm hopeful. Yes, I'm hopeful. That doesn't mean to say we shouldn't bear down on costs, and I do think the work Mr. Foster has done on bearing down on the existing costs must continue whilst we reset. we simply can't take the foot off the gas, and that's what we're going to do.
That's right. We have to respect that we are in contract with counterparties, but we have to then also, though, re-evaluate the best way of completing the forward plan. And as I think through that reformulation, the resequencing, the reset, it gives opportunities where we can find different ways of commercially incentivising the outcomes that we want. So rather than the ones that we're getting at the moment.
I'm just going to express a bit of scepticism, if I may. But if I was one of your commercial partners and I was listening to you today and you're saying about how you need to reset, how HS2 as an organisation took on too much of the risks of the project at the beginning, how you need to bear down on costs, I'd be listening to that and I'd be thinking, why should I? Why should I change the base terms that we agreed already, that have already been agreed? They're still committed to delivering what they've delivered. I'm just not seeing where, and I'm hearing your language about the reset. I genuinely find it encouraging, but I'm just not seeing what the opportunity for rebaselining already agreed contracts, how that is really going to deliver significant cost savings. I'm sure there are opportunities at the margins, there's opportunities in future procurement, but you've talked a lot about renegotiating what's already there, and I'm just not seeing the opportunity.
Two things which are quite important, I think. It's a very good question. Firstly, the longer this continues, the supply chain themselves have an elevated risk profile.
Okay.
So the longer we end up in a situation where people are scrutinising costs, you get into an adversarial contractual position which won't serve any of us right. So it is in the interest of the counterparties to have good contracts that are productive, coherent and lower risk. At the moment, although the risk balance is with HS2, clearly if this continues and went into a contractual situation that has happened many times in my career around the world, nobody wants to be there. So everybody's incentivized to make this coherent. And secondly, these are the supply chain partners who want to, at some future date, build Euston, or if the railway was ever exploited in the north, they want to do that. They are genuinely committed to the productivity of HS2 and UK PLC, and I speak that as somebody who used to run one of these companies. So two things, de-risking fundamentally for their shareholders, and I really believe they are partners who want to make HS2 Phase 1 a success.
Very quickly, Chair, can I just also, I guess, express the view that given the width still of this funding envelope, there's 49 to 66 billion in 2019 prices. Again, if I was one of the commercial partners, I'd be looking at that and think that that creates an opportunity. And I think that remains a risk to this project and a risk to your very best efforts, which I don't doubt, to try and renegotiate some of these costs.
What I found on the Elizabeth line, where this exact thing happened, I found the exact opposite. That when the opportunity was created for people to be coherent, lower risk, productive, people really came to the party. We will, though, really strengthen HS2's commercial management. I think we would acknowledge that we need to continue to improve the strength of our commercial management, and that is going to be a top priority for myself and Mr. Foster in parallel with a reset, just in case what you're suggesting comes to pass. But the twin-prong attack.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for that excellent question, Ms. Horney. On your point about rapidly renegotiating these contracts, there has been an impression in various people connected with this project that HS2, huge organisation, has wielded the big stick, whether it be over local authorities, whether it be individual communities. And I'm a little bit concerned here on these contracts. You will be talking to the big lead contractors, but they are backed up by a lot of really small businesses who I suspect at this moment are in deep financial trouble the longer this goes on. So when you're renegotiating these contracts, can we have a little bit of sympathy and consideration of how these lead contractors are going to treat their sub-suppliers?
Yeah, I mean, there are 2,400 small and medium enterprises supporting HS2. So it's a well-made point, Chair, and I'm absolutely convinced that the renegotiation and the commercial management must take on board a holistic view to the supply chain. Do you want to comment on that?
No, absolutely. I recognise the pressure. It's something that we do monitor. We do look at the different levels within our supply chain, and our payment practices and processes are intended to make sure that there is money there to flow down and support. But it's a careful balance, isn't it? We need to drive value for money. On the overall programme, we will be looking for better terms, improved incentives that align better to incentives, and so we'll need to see more innovation as well in the practices that are played. But we absolutely take that point on board, and it's incorporated.
Now, Dame Bernadette, we turn to the subject of Euston. Can we, first of all, for a point of clarification, be absolutely certain that this line is going to run from Old Oak Common to Euston?
So the government has indicated that that is its intention. It has committed to publicly fund the tunnelling from Old Oak Common to Euston, and I think that's an important commitment in this regard, signals clear intent. And we are currently, of course, and I will ask Mr Over to talk in detail about this, very actively working on a plan to ensure a high-speed station at Euston, but we wish to see that privately funded. So that is absolutely the intention, yes.
Well, we'll hand over to Mr Over. And in handing over, I mean, one of the key aspects of Euston is how much money you're going to get in from the private sector. Now, I understand that you're expecting, or in your current estimates, it's 6 billion. As a property man, and I declare my interest as a chartered surveyor, I would have thought that 6 billion is a very tough target to reach. But over to you, Mr Over, please.
Thanks. I'd like to start by saying we recognise your point, and that made by Professor Travers, that we need to get Euston sorted, and we think we're making substantial progress in doing so. The commitment to publicly fund the tunnelling is welcome and is a signal of intent, but we need the right station at the end of it, both for HS2, but we also need to look at the site holistically, and there's really 4 elements that we need to bring together. There's obviously the delivery of the HS2 station, there's the redevelopment of the existing station, which is having operational challenges and is a time-expired asset. There's also getting the underground station working in a way that can improve its performance and handle the increased capacity. And crucially, there's the commercial and housing developments, both around the station with oversight and adjacent site development, but importantly around the site as well with Camden and the work that MHCLG are doing. So the Euston endeavour is partly solving HS2, but it's solving that problem holistically. And our problems in the past have been to try to solve each part separately and hope that they fit together. That hasn't been effective. We've now got an approach that we're building a consensus and unified delivery by trying to make sure that we look at all that together with an integrated spatial design, an integrated delivery company to sit over contracts that will deliver each element of it and do so in a way that allows effective construction but also maintenance of the operation of the underground station and the conventional station whilst this is built. Lord Hendy spoke to this. You know, we saw the tunnel boring machines going in at Old Oak Common, so that there is tangible progress, but there's still a lot of work to do in setting up those delivery arrangements and making sure that they deliver effectively. And in the time that it takes to do that, we're very conscious of the impact that this has on the local community and the local residents, where they've already had many years of disruption, and what they want to see is a clear plan as to how we resolve this. So we're providing advice at the moment to ministers and to Treasury. I think, and that is how we deliver this in terms of the structures that I've set, how we make sure it's integrated with Camden and delivered in partnership with them, how we make sure that that wider economic benefit through housing and commercial development is secured, but crucially how the funding comes together. And the funding, in my view, will have 4 components, and I'm not going to say that I don't know that it'll be 6 billion from the private sector. It'll be a mix. I can say that the components of those mixes will be potential private financing of the HS2 station, which we're looking at very actively with the Treasury, and we've done some early market testing, and we think that that's viable. It does require us to have a clean scope and make it investable, and that will require work. We think that there will be development receipts from the work that we're doing with Lend-Lease and potentially with Camden around the site in terms of the commercial exploitation of the land that's owned by the Secretary of State and Network Rail. There's potential for tax increment finance or local contributions. We have to be measured about how much they would be, but Camden or the GLA are willing to contemplate that. And then there would be residual public funding as well. So what I want to do in making sure that that integrated delivery approach comes together is that we do the financial engineering that allows us to optimise across those 4 different funding sources. And what I can't tell you at the moment is the exact mix that will come out from that.
When you get to this reset, you're going to have to work out how much money you're going to get in from those 4 different sources to know how much public money is going to be put in. And the amount of public money that's going to be put in obviously determines the private return, because clearly the more infrastructure you put in, the bigger return you're going to get from the private sector. So how are you going to resolve that conundrum?
We have a starting assumption, and we know what we're thinking in terms of the high-level estimated costs of the station components. We've also market tested the potential for private financing, and we've been working with Lend-Lease on the potential for the commercial returns. So I think there's reasonable estimates around how we can bring those together. What we need to do is take the decisions on the delivery model, take the decisions on the spatial allocation, and then get into the detailed design of the station components. And then we can go to the market and say, well, what space does that leave for commercial development? What scope does that leave for private financing to cost? And then you begin the financial engineering. There will be some iteration in that.
That's very helpful. Ms. Kelly, I did give myself a parameter, which I'm now going to break. But part of the problem with the lack of accountability with the HS2 in the initial stages was the HS2 board and your representatives on it, and the board was not scrutinising the finances properly because they weren't even being given the finances properly by HS2 Limited. I don't say that in order to go over old ground. I say it because every single new organisation that you set up has to have a governance organisation in it. And the more organisations you set up, the more boundaries you're going to have, and the more complex it becomes. So perhaps either a question for you or Mr. Over is, why are you contemplating setting up even more different organisations? For example, why are we going to have a new body for delivering HS2 station? Why can't HS2 deliver their own station?
So the decision to, as it were, remove Euston from the scope of HS2 Limited's work was taken in the wake of receiving 2 unaffordable estimates, essentially, for the design of the station. And that forced a rethink for how we were going to address Euston. I do support your sort of point that setting up new organisations is really hard. I think that it's far more complex and difficult than is often thought, and we need to pause quite carefully before rushing into that as a solution in general. And our experience on HS2 with HS2 Limited demonstrates that it's really difficult to set up high-functioning new organisations doing extremely complex infrastructure delivery. I think in this instance, though, I think there really is quite a strong argument for needing something that is different from HS2 Limited, because we have, as Mr. Over was explaining, we have a high-speed station, a conventional station, an underground, and an enormous sort of housing and investment opportunity. So it's quite a sort of different proposition at Euston than what HS2 Limited is currently doing, which is namely building a railway. What we're looking at as I say, something more complex with more moving parts and different opportunities actually within it. In that context, and given that we need the GLA, we need Camden, we need Network Rail, we need TfL, all to be part of the sort of strategic partnership for delivering a Euston solution. I think a different delivery model does actually make sense. It is also the case, as Mr. Over has just explained, this is also about attracting in private investment, which is a different skill set and a different set of technical challenges.
And could I just add to that, Geoffrey? Sorry, I'm completely with you that we shouldn't casually set up new organisations, nor should we casually expect them to be well performing and well governed and less carefully structured. And that's what we're very much focusing on. I think Dame Bernadette's right that some of the discipline that getting to an investable place for private sector partners will require us to do that. But we do need the right governance structures that can deal with those trade-offs that we've tried to solve by setting up an organisation. It's no good if those trade-offs are then not resolved within that organisation. So I'm looking carefully at how we set up the board and constitution of a new delivery company, but also what the financial participation is and what the shareholding would be in effect between the different bodies that Bernadette has set up. So we need to get the financial incentives right so people look at their own interests but also at the collective interest, and that's what we've really been missing. But having that in one entity rather than dispersed across four gives us a better chance at a coherent solution and effective and efficient delivery.
So can we just examine a little bit the timetable and when we're going to get some financial certainty over this? Is this work, and Euston is an incredibly complex, it's probably one of the most complex, if not the most complex bit of the whole HS2 project. Is this going on in parallel with the reset? And will the timetable be the same as the reset, or are we expecting this work to go beyond the reset before? So in other words, what I'm saying is, how are we going to get a total cost envelope, and is this going to delay consideration of the total cost envelope?
So the work's going to go on in parallel, and the interaction is limited. So HS2 Limited will remain responsible for putting in the systems and operating the station, but the construction of the station will be separated from their budget and their estimate, and then at the moment that's a responsibility that comes back to the Department for Transport. We expect to progress the delivery model and the financial assumptions over the next year. So in terms of timescales, they'll probably come together at the same time, but they're not intimately intertwined in a way that will hold the wider work that Mark's described up.
Thank you. Ruth Cadley.
Yes, my biggest fear is that the future station, 3 stations in one, won't be big enough for the passenger throughput that could be. If the envelope of it is reduced, if the external funding isn't available. So how are you going to address that risk that there could be pressures to reduce the scope of the station if the external funding isn't coming in to build a big enough station, given how overcrowded Euston is at the moment?
Yeah, and that's very much first and foremost in our thinking. We're doing lots of demand modelling with Network Rail, with TfL and with HS2, but also with Camden about the organic demand that the economic growth there might create. So we're refreshing that. And there is a trajectory, and the further that trajectory gets away, the more uncertain it becomes. But we're very much trying to design this to make sure that it is future-proofed, and that might have staging points. So if we take the HS2 station as an example, we think if we look at this across the line of route and the decisions that were taken by the last government and are yet to be opined on by this government, 6 platforms will be sufficient to provide all the foreseeable services unless there's a major expansion of the network in the future. But we do want to make sure that our successors have that option, so we're actively planning for future-proofing at the HS2 station that would make provision for additional 3 platforms or possibly 4 platforms next to the ones that we have a concrete plan to build. Now that option could be called later, and we need to do work on how actively that's provided for, because the more active provision you make, the more front-loading of the cost you provide. Conversely, if we don't put enough future-proofing into it, it's very difficult to return to at a later date. So we're trying to make sure that that is protected and to work across the 3 stations to make sure that there's an integrated view of demand, but that we don't build for demand that hasn't yet appeared, but we don't preclude the option to make sure that we can accommodate future demand, because that is essentially the purpose of this. We want to use this scheme and address the problems on the conventional station at the moment in a way that fosters transport use, and that's fostering economic growth.
And I ask this question because the Elizabeth line is an example that has way exceeded its projections in the first year of operation. So it's a really live question from passengers current and future.
Completely right. And the only thing we can be certain of that our projections will be wrong, and that's why we need to have ranges and flexibility.
Thank you, Sir Geoffrey.
I think we might have echoed those words when we started. Sarah Olney.
Just continuing on Euston, Mr. Over, local residents and the continued uncertainty, I think, around the future of Euston, which seems, from your previous answers, projected to continue for quite some time, obviously having a very negative effect on local businesses that might be trying to find investment, or people who perhaps, needing to raise a family in the local area. It's a really challenging situation, and in the last Parliament, those of us who were on the committee then, we paid a visit to Euston, and as well as being very impressed at all of the work that's happened there so far, it's really evident when you go there quite what an impact the continued work is having on the local community, and yet currently it doesn't look like there's much sort of many answers to quite how long that disruption is going to continue. What is the department doing to try and best manage that disruption and that continued impact?
Well, I hope you heard me say earlier that I really do feel that keenly, and we work closely with Camden, who support us but are also critical of us in making sure that the interests of their residents are properly focused. It isn't acceptable that we don't have a clearer plan, and that's why we're vigorously trying to get to one, and we'll set that out and engage with local communities. But the truth of the matter is that plan will take a decade or more to come to fruition, and that will be continuing to disrupt local businesses and local communities during that period. What we can commit to do is to provide transparency about where we've got to and engage them in the process, and Camden is correctly pushing us to do that as fulsomely as possible. I don't want to mislead people that there are easy answers here, but I do at the same time need to reflect actively on the real impacts that the uncertainty is having, and the real impacts that will be there once we remove the uncertainty and have concrete plans.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you very much, Ms. Olney. Sorry.
Can I come in on residents?
Of course, absolutely. Ms. Canterbury.
Thank you, Sir Geoffrey. On the issue of residents impacted by HS2, I was on Transport Committee in May last year when we went to Buckinghamshire and spoke to a number of stakeholders from the county council to parish councils, landowners, farmers and residents who had an almost universal regret at the way HS2 were communicating with them. They accepted the rail line was being built. They no longer opposed that, but they felt that they were being treated unfairly and with disrespect, and sometimes quite rudely by HS2. And in terms of land purchase, some things could have gone a lot better and a lot easier had better processes been in place, which would have saved HS2 money as well. Is there going to be any kind of reset? Is there an acknowledgement that has been a challenge? And is there any kind of reset and review of that within HS2?
I'll take that. First of all, I'd say it's very disappointing to hear that feedback, because I do want to be clear that we do really care about the communities that we are operating within, and for that also the landowners and homeowners who we are in the process of agreeing property transactions with. So we do care, and we are investing an awful lot of time and effort to try and improve those experiences, and so there is an absolute commitment to do that. I think we have made some substantial improvements in our processes over time in terms of the period that's gone through there. And I did meet very recently our two commissioners, who are also the Residents Commissioner and construction committee who are there to give an independent voice of feedback and advice to us in terms of what we're doing. And some encouraging signs in terms of what we're doing. But clearly, we've still got to listen and improve. But if I can just say, we do realise that the best way where there is disruption is that we are in a position to keep people informed around what's taking place, and then that we respond quickly to their queries and concerns. I think there is well-established resources and processes to make sure that we are updating as early as possible around disruption, that information, and we do have a 24/7, 365 days a year response line for people to call and respond to. We're really focused on those most urgent queries that come through that, and I'm proud to say that we are at the moment in a position where 100% of all of those queries have been dealt with in 2 days in terms of that for this year. So all in all, I'd say is that it's an area of great focus to us. We need to listen and reflect, and if there's any specific concerns that people want to highlight, please do let us know to make sure that we're on it.
Okay, thank you.
I think that will come as a great relief to many property owners out there. I heard of one case where HS2 took quite a lot of land off them, hadn't paid them for 3 years. They got the bill from the Inland Revenue for capital gains and still hadn't had the money from you to pay the capital gains tax bill. Now, these sort of examples, and it was quite a big bit of land, it was quite a lot of money. These sorts of examples are the sort of examples that give you HS2 a really bad reputation. So I am grateful for that reassurance, and I'm sure property owners, householders along the line will be reassured by the reset in that respect.
And also residents not knowing in the morning whether they can take their kids to school or go to work on the route that they've normally used, and they have to go a long way round and then end up being late.
No, well,
that's an important point that Ms Cadbury raises, and also the whole way you handle local authorities. I would suspect that if you handle local authorities a little better, planning permissions for all your various bits of the line would be a lot easier.
That has been a key area of focus for us.
Thank you. So on the general point, I'm going to come on to some specifics in a minute about selling off property. In terms of selling off, can we have it as a sort of fairly cardinal principle that when property is sold off, it will be, wherever possible, offered back to the person from whom it was purchased? Many will have moved on. Many people will have had their house purchased and they will have moved on. But there will be some that would actually quite like to move back into their house. So can those sorts of requests be handled sympathetically?
I think we would endeavour to handle requests sympathetic. We are our responsibility is, of course, to achieve value for money in terms of the resale of lands and to follow the very strict laws that are in place, the Critchell Down rules, in terms of the way in which the property and land should be considered as it goes through that resale process. But there should be consideration for those requests. And so,
Bernadette, this is where the department can come in, I think. I have been involved in a number of cases with Critchell Down rules in the past. It can take years, if not decades, to resolve these problems. I just think in some of the issues, particularly the smaller issues rather than the bigger ones where people's houses have been purchased, there should be some sympathy of how these matters are dealt with.
Understood, and I'm far less expert on the Critchell Down rules than the company, or it sounds as if you are. But look, it's there. The framework is there to provide a sort of fair balance in managing the interest on the one hand for the taxpayer of securing value for money, and on the other, the individuals who've been affected and have sold their homes and may now want to return to them. So I think the process needs to be followed, the rules need to be applied, but they need to be applied in a way which remembers that there are human beings at the end of this process as well.
Exactly. Can I ask you a question of policy, which is not something this committee, but it does affect the finances considerably. The protection of the line of phase 2B, phase 2. The government have announced, I think the previous government did, and I think it's this present government's policy, that the line is not to be protected, which means that we could get all sorts of planning applications which would make building of a future phase 2 much more difficult. Is that still the policy?
I'll ask Mr. Over to cover this point, please.
There's two aspects to this. One is safeguarding, and then one is how we treat the land that was already acquired. So the safeguarding, to begin with, is treated differently on the former western leg and the former eastern leg. The former western leg, which is the 2A bill and the route to Manchester, safeguarding was lifted by the last government. Safeguarding remains in place on the eastern leg because some parts of that need to be retained at the request of local authorities, and we have to decide which is to be retained before we can lift it and then reinsert it. Land acquisition, then, the current government hasn't taken a position on yet, so we're providing that advice at the moment, and they're reflecting on the position that they inherited. But we have about half of the land purchased on the former 2A scheme, and the powers to acquire further land expire in early 26. And then for the section between Crewe and Manchester, the bill that was in Parliament would have brought forward powers to acquire that land. So it's very much in the hands of the ministers at the moment, and we're providing that initial advice, but that will cover both their intent for any long-term decisions on strategic rail investment, and that will then have consequences as to whether land is either bought or sold, or whether it's re-safeguarded, or whether safeguarding is how it's lifted on the eastern leg. Setting all that aside, there is some land that we're very confident that isn't going to be required under any plausible scheme, and we'll be looking to release that in a sensible and sensitive way so that the communities don't suffer that detriment, and so the Exchequer gets the revenue back.
When will those policy decisions be made? Because again, people are looking to see whether they could purchase their old properties back, and if my deputy chair were here representing Sheffield, there were some of the schemes that were rejected or not going to proceed with quite some way ago, for example the Doncaster and Sheffield bit. So when will decisions be made on all of that?
It's right that the new government, and particularly the new Secretary of State, has time to consider these options and then work them through, and some aspects of them really need collective agreement about what the long-term strategy is for strategic rail investment. So we need to give them that time. I think it's a matter of months, not a matter of years, and I'm very conscious in giving that advice that we're making sure that the clarity is provided in either direction for the people that are impacted.
Okay. Peter Fortune.
Thank you. Just on that, for my benefit, and I apologise for my ignorance here, if land has been acquired by a CPO for a project that it's then subsequently not used for, are there any limits or rules on what can be done with any profits that come out of that?
The Critchell Down rules are really set up to make sure that the government isn't speculatively making money by selling land that it's compulsory purchase for one reason to a different party for a different reason, and that is where some of the protections for the original owners come into play. There's a set of 6 or 7 rules that I'm not an expert on either, but that is one of those protections.
I'll go and look those up then. That's my interest. My question was actually for Mr. Foster, which is about the decommissioning of the sites in phase 2. Can you just give us an update for that, please?
We have put together a full plan for the safe remediation of that plans, and it was actually covered in the NAO review. We're in the process of now refining and optimising that activity, but then waiting instruction in terms of whether to go ahead with that plan.
Okay, so I think the original plan was to be completed in 27, is that right?
That's right. So yeah, the plan would be that we can deliver that plan within 3 years and within that timeline.
An estimated cost of about 100 million. Has anything changed?
Up to 100 million. Yeah.
Okay.
Right. As it's reported in the report.
As it's reported in there. Okay. Thank you, Chair. I'll leave it there.
Sarah Olney.
Thank you, Chair. Dame Bernadette, the decommissioning costs so far have been £2.2 billion, I think that's correct, or that's the loss that's being reported to date. Can you perhaps give some reflection on how the costs have got to that level and what lessons the department may have learned from the decommissioning work that it's carried out?
So there are, I'm not quite sure what's in decommissioning costs. I'm assuming you're talking about also impairment costs, i.e. costs of 2A, 2B, which are now impairment costs because
so maybe if I just clarify, so in HS2's annual report and accounts we did report the £2 billion constructive loss. Now that was the component of that is effectively 1.1 billion related to spend on the development of the phase 2A and 2B bills prior to second reading, and then there was an impairment of around £950 million which related to the build of the assets that was taking place once the bill had been approved. So it has those two components.
Thank you.
Well, I think Mr. Foster may be in a better place than me to describe what the various elements of that spend are.
I think the question is more about the lessons learned. I mean, the costs are the costs. Obviously, there weren't costs that were planned at the start of the project because we planned to finish it. But what are the lessons that have been learned by the department from?
Well, we are still mining the lessons learned from HS2. You won't be surprised to hear, and I'm happy to say a little bit more about how we're doing that actually, because we've done some internal work already with the Treasury, IPA, and HS2 Limited on all of the lessons to date, and there is further work currently being done as part of the independent review of governance that ministers have commissioned. So there is broader work on reflections on this particular aspect of lessons. Well, I guess the really obvious lesson is it's good, as I said, to have a plan and stick to it. And if we are changing scope in a very major way when a project is already well in flight, then that has a financial cost to it. And I think, it's an obvious thing to say, but I do think a profound point about our experience of HS2 Limited, our experience of HS2 is, and that needs to inform all of our future infrastructure plans, is that we need to be very clear when we set out on a large project, that we are very clear what it is there to achieve. We need to have within our political system, and accepting that politics is a real thing, but we need to have some way, I think, of having a bit of stickiness, really, once we've developed a plan, to develop it and deliver it to its conclusion if we want to avoid incurring wasteful costs, just as we actually did very successfully on the Elizabeth line. So there are some very positive lessons from the Elizabeth line, it seems to me, we can learn about that. I dare say there are more practical things around how those costs arose, about how they might have been minimised. But ultimately, if we're going to cancel programmes when they've been, some years in development, that will unfortunately result in nugatory costs.
And I appreciate I'm getting slightly into a hypothetical here, but if you find yourself in a position in the future where you are needing to assess the costs of stopping a programme versus the costs of continuing it, what lessons from the stopping of the phase 2 will you be able to apply? I
might ask colleagues for reflections. Process. Are there, in a sense, this was driven by political uncertainty and political decision making rather than, I think, the practical delivery of the project. But I don't know, Mr. Over, you've got more to say.
A couple of thoughts, if I may. I mean, one is that if we're more certain at the start of the project what the likely cost is going to be, then the chances of it being reopened reduce. I think they can't be eliminated, but that front loading of investment. But there's also a conceptual shift in how we set out our delivery of infrastructure, which perhaps is too much focused on grand project or big schemes that are binary. You do them or you don't do them. I know HS2 was broken up into 3 subsections, but they're pretty big subsections. And what I think we're exploring at the moment is, can you set a long-term intent and then deliver it in smaller incremental stages? A number of benefits to that is it's easier to commit to each stage, but it has to be done coherently with the ultimate aim that you're trying to get to. Secondly, it is more controllable in terms of a project, and you can learn the lessons from the first stage and reapply them to the second stage more swiftly. Thirdly, it's likely to bring forward passenger benefits and economic benefits sooner because it doesn't rely on the whole thing. Now, at some point that doesn't work because you have to get from Birmingham to London And if you don't want any stops in between, then that's a big section that needs to be delivered. But in terms of northern infrastructure, what we're trying to do on Transpennine route upgrade, or what we might do in terms of northern connectivity, that more staged delivery towards an ultimate big ambition still is something that I think would help and then would minimise the consequences of the nugatory costs that we're facing here.
I think I agree with all of that. At a practical level, clearly part of the reason we've seen the cancellation of 2A and 2B is because the costs were rising so fast on phase 1. We know that. So there are practical lessons around cost estimation as well that we are drawing from our experience, which we will certainly be building into future projects. It's very clear. The further back you go with HS2 now, the more wildly optimistic we can see the cost estimates were. I think we've learned a lot from bitter experience on this programme about how you do cost estimation and how you do it more realistically and robustly, and that's a massive lesson for everything we try to do in government on infrastructure delivery, I think. I do think, to my point about changing scope and the sort of challenges of that, I think this government is committed to a 10-year infrastructure plan and to setting up a new national infrastructure authority, and I think we need to take the opportunities both of a long-term plan and the NISTA, this new authority, to really ensure that we are embedding good practice in how we set projects up such that they don't find themselves being truncated later and incurring those sorts of costs.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Olney. That's very helpful. We now go to Sarah Green, please. Sarah Hall. Too many Sarahs. Sarah, I'm so sorry. Sarah Hall. Yeah, I'm so sorry.
Today, don't worry. Thank you. So I just wanted to go back to focus on phase 2, but from a growth perspective, how much value will phase 1 on its own provide to the UK economy as compared to including phase 2 and 2A and 2B? Has that been considered?
So when I did my accounting officer assessment at the time of the Network North announcement by the previous government, and Chair will, I'm sure, recall the lengthy discussion we've previously had about that, I did an assessment of continuing with phase 1, a value for money assessment that produced a BCR range at that point based on a number of sort of scenarios of between 1.1 to 1.8. So that was the BCR of phase 1. One of the things that the decision not to continue with phase 2 did was obviously reduce the capacity in effect of phase 1, so it had a negative impact on the of the benefits, because obviously you're not running trains on 12 to 13, 14 to 15 trains I think we were previously anticipating going north. So obviously it had an impact on reducing the values of phase 1. I'm afraid I can't offhand recall. We did have separate, before cancellation, BCRs and business cases for phase 2. I just don't have that data to hand. I don't know if Mr. Over you can remember it, but we can certainly we can.
I mean, given the significance of phase 2 for the overall project, given that it was to obviously the speed element but the capacity element, and given that the GFT has estimated itself that the West Coast Main Line is going to reach capacity by the mid-2030s, this surely is a priority to tackle. So, I mean, what are the alternatives that are being considered as this has been scrapped?
So, absolutely understand the issue, and I think the NAA report, and we would fully acknowledge, we do now face a capacity challenge in the late 2030s on the West Coast Main Line as a consequence of not building phase 2. I think the government has been clear that it doesn't intend to reinstate those northern sections, but it is also considering what the options do exist for dealing with capacity north of Birmingham at that point in future years. But I'll ask Alan Over to say a bit more.
Yeah, and that's right. We do project, if trend growth returns, that the West Coast Main Line capacity will be exhausted from the late 2030s, and that's advice we're giving to the current government. There doesn't have to be just infrastructure solutions to doing that, but there aren't easy alternatives. And I think if you listened to Mayors Parker and Mayors Burnham, they would say that this is a significant concern in terms of being a potential constraint on economic growth. So we do need to come to a view as a government, recognising the difficult fiscal position, what the long-term plan is. And, there's still time to address some of that. And as I say, we might be able to do smaller scale investments in infrastructure that wouldn't be a reinstatement of HS2 or anything like it. There's some stuff we can do in optimising services in terms of the trains that we run with the existing capacity, and that which will be augmented by HS2 that will alleviate some of that. So there's time to work this through.
There are fewer seats on those trains, though, aren't there? And there are infrastructure problems around the station sizes and the platform sizes.
That's right. That's correct.
And that feels a little bit like a sticking plaster and a kind of second best option. You've got the kind of London to Birmingham option, and then the phase 2 option. We get the kind of some extra longer trains. Doesn't seem that's what the issue really.
That's why the government does have to look at this issue and is doing so. But I don't want to prejudge the collective views on how to work that through. But I do also need to say there isn't just one answer, which is reinstate HS2. There's infrastructure options below that. There's also some stuff we can do with rolling stock and service patterns, but those, if the projections are right, as you say, will delay the problem, not resolve it. South of Birmingham, HS2 has provided sufficient capacity that all reasonable growth scenarios can be covered, and it will release more capacity for freight, but also for regional commuter services too.
Okay, that's fine. Can I just ask on that finally, has the department looked at the effect of the cancellation on tackling regional inequalities, particularly in the smaller towns in the northwest of England?
Not specifically. We're looking at that through the Northern Connectivity Programme as well, though, which I'm also responsible for. So, and working with Northern leaders on what their transport priorities are, and the questions there are. I think it's important we take a wide framework on this in terms of transport. There's benefits from widening the urban areas of cities and making sure local transport is getting people into where the economic activity is concentrated. There's agglomeration effects for joining up our big northern cities, but there's also regional economic effects for how we connect the big three economic regions and how they interact with each other. And it's important we look at those in the round. The government is committed to dealing with northern connectivity as a manifesto priority, and we're already delivering the early benefits from Transpennine route upgrade, which is a foundation for that further work.
And I would just say a view on the relative priority of all the things that we could do on transport investment is something that will need to be addressed in the spending review and in the government's 10-year infrastructure plan. That'll need to look at rail connectivity east-west, north-south. It'll need, as Alan Over indicates, to look at the balance between intercity investment and investment in local and regional transport. And some choices will have to be made because we know that the fiscal environment is a tough one. So I know for a fact that whatever the conclusion of that is, it will not include all of the transport investment that my department would ideally like to see, but we just have to recognise that choices are inevitable in a constrained environment and seek to make the ones which are as effective as possible in driving the government's missions, its plan for change, and in tackling some of the challenges of inequity in towns and regions.
Just on that, in terms of Northern Powerhouse Rail then, is it still viable following the cancellation, would you say, of HS2 Phase 2?
So what the government has said is that it is committed to improving Northern Rail connectivity east to west, and we'll need to look very actively at how we do that, and there is development work going on to do that. I'm slightly stepping back from the language of Northern Powerhouse Rail because I think, as Mr. Over indicated, there's actually it's important if we think about what we are going to try and achieve through rail investment in the north, that we look at it as a series of programmes and choices rather than a sort of big totemic thing, which, as we know, with HS2 Limited has become quite problematic as we try and deliver things. I did an accounting officer assessment under the previous government that was published following the election, the plan that the previous government had set out, and there are big value for money challenges around Northern Powerhouse Rail, but there are also a number of things that could be taken and would need to be taken to address those value for money. That's what you mean by viability challenges. In the end, as I say, government's going to need to take a choice through the spending review and the infrastructure plan on what investment it prioritises.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Sarah Green.
Thank you, Chair. My question's for Mark Wilde, and you're only a few weeks into your job, and I fully acknowledge that. But I'm keen to know what changes you're planning on how HS2 Limited operates. And you've already talked about the reset, but can you expand on some of the changes you plan, and maybe what lessons from your experience at Crossrail you can draw on, and how you can apply them to HS2 Limited?
Thank you. Just to acknowledge Sir John Thompson and Alan Foster's work actually in the past year. HS2 is already on the journey of change. It's just actually completing quite a major reorganisation, and it created a role called the Chief Railway Officer with somebody called Emma Head, very capable professional, which is a direct lesson from Crossrail. So I'm inheriting a ship with Alan here that is already recognising its need for change, and we're coming to an end of a cycle which I think for HS2 people has been quite a significant change, and it's reduced the number of people, it's put the wiring, you might say, in the right position.
What exactly?
For me, looking forward, I would say change in HS2 Limited is pretty fundamental. Reset the programme, recontractualise our relationship with the supply chain, and make HS2 responsive to those requirements are the three things that I need to do. All three of them are significant, what you might term interventions, and they're all interdependent. The three things that HS2 Limited needs to do are relatively straightforward, but they might take, again, a little bit of time. Firstly, we need to reinforce our frontline teams managing the contractors, bearing down on costs, driving productivity, because to the previous answers, it is quite a difficult and complex thing to renegotiate. But right now, as the Chair said, we are 31,000 people out there spending a lot of public money. So number one, I think we need to reinforce our frontline teams, rebalance. Some of that has occurred, but there's more to do, particularly in areas such as the commercial functions of HS2. Secondly, with the systems contracts coming on board, we need to really get into the more end state issues. So, we have an infrastructure maintainer to actually stand up, which is a major program in its own right. It's actually a very, very good time to be doing this, while the civil engineering is kind of we're at the beginning of the end of civil engineering, I would say. But there's still a long way to go. In parallel, we really do need to make HS2 a capable systems infrastructure maintainer. So there is a lot to do in that space. Good plans, but we need to create the organisation that will operate this railway in the future. Thirdly, and I think quite profoundly, HS2's culture needs to change to be more focused on the singular task of delivering Phase 1 at the lowest feasible cost. To be fair to HS2 Limited, its task 2 years ago was somewhat differently. I can't opine whether it was doing well or badly, but I do know now we are more a singular task, and certainly with Alan Foster, we will be committed to that. So reinforce our capabilities, particularly at the front line, make us a more capable systems organisation. Thirdly, change and pivot HS2 to be a singular purpose of delivering this for the lowest feasible cost. I'm very heartened, though, by the quality of the people in HS2, and I think we get the opportunity to implement it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah Green. Dame Bernadette, I think, if anything from what's happened in the last 10 or 12 years tells us, is that the department didn't have enough control over the whole project, over costs and everything else. This reset, we've heard lots of encouraging words this morning, this reset's going, but what are you going to do differently in the department to make sure you do have a greater control, particularly over costs? It's all very well letting, and I'm sure Mark, I've got a lot of confidence in Mark, I know him from his previous project, but nevertheless, the department is the department that sponsors this project. It is controlling, it is responsible for the cost. What are you going to do differently this time around compared to what you've done in the past?
So I just want to say, first and foremost, we have always sought, actually, at all stages in the delivery of this project to ensure that there is effective and robust oversight by the department. It's been delivered through a framework agreement, a sponsor board, a task force, a ministerial task force. We strengthened the government, I expect you'll recall, governance quite significantly at Notice to Proceed in 2020 when we appointed two special representatives to the board, and that was the point at which we set up the ministerial task force. So it is not, and we are constant. This is not, I think Mark and Alan would agree, they do not feel the lack of oversight from the department in the operations of HS2 Limited. The difficulty in particular that we've seen is that when the underpinning information that the company is receiving, the board is receiving, and then the department is receiving is unreliable, it's very hard to sort of provide the appropriate level of intervention. That said, I do just want to give a flavour of what we have been doing. As soon as we saw costs increase, we have commissioned reviews, remediation plans. We have worked with HS2 Limited on to establish a strategy on the main works civils renegotiation. We obviously worked with the chair to recruit Mark Wilde, whose leadership I think will be absolutely critical going forward and will be an important part of the change that we now want to see. That all of this oversight, however, I have to acknowledge, has not delivered ultimately the outcome and the level of cost control that we need to see on this programme. So I accept that point entirely. In terms of what we are going to change, we have an independent review being conducted at the moment by James Stewart, commissioned by incoming ministers a few months ago. He is currently concluding his work, and so I don't want to sort of preempt it. He hasn't yet concluded it. It hasn't yet been formally sort of considered by ministers, and we will need to acknowledge it. But it is going to make a number of changes or proposals for change to our future oversight and sponsorship of this programme. So I know he is going to make proposals for how we organise our own boards within the department and for how we work with HS2 Limited in order to build greater trust, transparency and collaboration in the delivery of this project, as well as more effective control. So there will be more to come on that, but I think I won't be able to give you a detailed answer to what changes we expect to implement until we've received his review and decided how to take forward his recommendations.
I accept that answer and the kind of which you've answered it, but within this reset timetable, which you haven't been able to tell us this morning exactly how long it's going to take, will his report be completed within time so that you can actually give us the information so that when it comes to the reset announcement with hopefully a reliable figure, but also all the governance and control issues, they will all be addressed all at the same time, wrapped up together, so that the public will have confidence when we get this reset announcement that it's likely to be a much more reliable outcome than has been hitherto.
I actually expect changes to our governance and oversight to happen much sooner than that.
Right.
They're relatively more straightforward to determine and execute. The independent review is concluding at the moment. Mr. Stewart's coming to the end of his work. I expect us to be able to consider, and ministers to consider his recommendations very early in the new year. And then we will want to implement the changes that we think are sensible and needed for this programme as quickly as possible. Right. So I would expect to be able to tell you more about that much sooner than the whole reset.
Okay. Can I just ask, there's been one or two sort of changes, or even, I don't know, additional key personnel. So can we just clarify what the status of that was? In paragraph 4.4 on page 30, a new organisation structure, HS2, has established a new role of Chief Railway Officer. This new role is intended to act as a guiding mind with responsibility for integration and focusing programme decisions on how best to deliver the railway rather than individual component projects. I thought you were doing that, Mr. Wilde, but who is this person?
No, I just, I just referenced that, but I will restate it. So one of the key lessons from Crossrail...
No, but who is the person? Is that
you? The person
you?
is Emma Head, who is the Chief Railway Officer, very capable person who's been on the programme for several years, was our Head of Safety, and is now the Chief Railway Officer, who is the guiding mind, taking instruction from the department and turning it into the engineering configuration.
Okay. And we're also getting a resident commissioner and construction commissioner being combined in one role, Dame Bernadette. Is that correct? Who is that person? When are they going to be appointed, and what exactly are they going to do?
Those two roles are already in place, and we've had good support from the current commissioners. Their contracts are coming to an end, and they've kindly agreed to extend those. But the function of both of those roles is to make sure that there's an independent view looking at the impacts of construction on local communities and residents, but also making sure that the residents' interests are protected, for example, in the case of compulsory purchase or other decisions. Given the reducing volume of work, both in terms of new property acquisition on phase 1 and the beginning of the end of construction that Mark talked to, the ministers have decided that they should be combined into one role that will still be independent and will still make sure that our ministers and HS2 Limited are very firmly aware of any concerns that people impacted by the construction or the purchase of land are feeling. The two commissioners came to see Lord Hendy earlier this week and gave their views on performance and were positive about the progress that HS2 Limited was making. So that's not a new set of people, not a new set of arrangements. It's a consolidated way of making sure those existing protections are delivered in the future. The recruitment process is underway, and we would expect to have a candidate announced at the start of next financial year.
There will be, Dame Bernadette, a commissioner with significant powers. Presumably they will have powers to call for any papers they want. Any information won't be withheld from them, and they presumably will report to you and you to ministers. Is that how it's going to work?
They will report to ministers, in effect, and obviously we would want to ensure that they have access to all the information to enable them to do their jobs appropriately.
We're almost at the end, unless Peter Fortune.
It's a very quick one, thank you, and this is sort of London-centric, because Mark may remember when I was chairman of the London Budget Scrutiny Committee, so some of this is déjà vu. In terms of Euston and the development of the Euston site, have there been any conversations with the Mayor about setting that up as an MDC?
There's two models being contemplated in terms of the wider Euston development. There's a mayoral-led development corporation, but also a Camden-led one, and we're talking to the GLA and to Camden about preferences for that. That would be a development area constituted under MHCLG's legislation, and would be designed to bring forward the wider housing and economic opportunities.
Again, I'm very familiar with these models before having worked with and tried to unwrap some of the challenges around the LLDC site. So, would you say, and I know Mark will be sort of cited on some of the complexities and difficulties that can throw up, and also how that might delay any progress, especially the negotiations with Camden.
Well said, but I would say the approach of a collaborative approach of all the parties being in an enterprise, owning the whole of it, has got to be the right thing, particularly when you're talking about very complex inputs and outputs. So I don't know what the decision would be, but certainly you're right to raise the complexity, but they can be made to work, and environments where everybody's around the table, I would have thought of probably the right thing.
I think that it's a two-layer thing. So the focus of that would be the area around the station, and the delivery company that I was describing earlier would be focusing on the station's delivery. But the two have to work in kilter. I do have to say we're working closely and very well with Camden, who are correctly challenging us in a tough way on behalf of their residents, but also being supportive of trying to do this in a different way.
So I would imagine Camden would want control of it because it's right in the heart of the borough. And I tell you what made me think of it was I just recalled a leaked report about the state of Euston Underground Station, and I think that was in November, talking about the fact that it would need a rebuild, which is why the concept of an MDC just jumped into my head. Can we be kept informed on that? Because I do think that is a huge issue. Thank you, Chair.
Right. Well, I think we're almost at the end of the session. So just for a bit of fun, I'm going to put you all on the spot and ask a $94,000 question. What year will we have a properly functioning high-speed railway from Euston to Birmingham? And I'll start with you, Mr. Foster, and work our way across our witnesses.
Up to $150,000 already.
I don't have an answer. I'm not focused on the delivery of the Euston, so I'm going to pass that one.
No. You're going to set the scene. I want a best estimate.
2037.
Golly. Mark, hope you're going to do better than that.
I'm going to be more circumspect. I think I've really got to do the work. You would hope that in the 2030s you would have a functioning railway, but the truth of the matter is I really do need to, sorry to be pour cold water, but I do need to do the work.
Well, given that we had an original estimate on phase 1, which was 2030 to 2032, I'm not quite sure why it slipped so much. So I'm going to just put Mark Wild on the spot for a start and see where he gets to.
I honestly, I think if I did speculate, I haven't done the work. I would say the current range that we have is under pressure, but I really do need to do the work. I'm sorry to be evasive.
All right.
But you're triggering my... I think if I did do it...
Well, I shall ask the question again in future sessions, so by then hopefully you'll have an answer.
You are
Dame Bernadette.
So the current range for phase 1 between Old Oak Common and Birmingham, which of course is different, is 2029 to 2033.
33. Sorry, yeah.
So that is the current range, which, as Mark has indicated, he considers to be under pressure. There will be trains running between Old Oak Common and Birmingham before there will be trains running between Euston and Birmingham. I think I can say that confidently. I think the schedule for Euston services has an outer limit of 2036, and our initial work or current work on Euston suggests we're still within that parameter.
I'm not over.
I'm going to listen to Mark's advice carefully.
So I think the sort of conclusion from the day is we don't know when the reset's going to take place, we don't know what the cost's going to be, and we don't precisely know when it's likely to come into operation. But there we are. We've probed as much as we can. So can I thank our witnesses very much for attending the committee today. An uncorrected transcript of this hearing will be published on the committee's website in the coming days. The committee will consider the helpful evidence that we've been given today and will produce a report with recommendations in due course, but inevitably after Christmas. Order.